Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first episode of Lived Experiences. I'm Estelle, and today we have with us Shreya. Shreya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Shreya Ganguly, and um, I am so excited to be here and to be talking about my experiences with Estelle. Um, and I'm so grateful that she reached out to me about this interview and was willing to have this conversation with me. And I've lived in several countries. I'm from India, but then I've spent about a decade in the US, where I've gone to school and I'm actually studying at the University of East Anglia in the UK now, but now I'm back in the US for the next few months. So I've spent most of my life living between several countries. I'm Indian, but I've lived in several other countries, so that has certainly informed my perspective, my educational experience, but also the opportunity to meet people from all over the world, just from a multitude of backgrounds.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that, Shreya. And just to set an intention for this conversation, we are here to create awareness on lived experiences with neurodivergence. And listening to you share and talk about how you've had a lot of experience, meeting different people, how has this had an impact or how has this helped you with your experiences as someone who is neurodivergent?
Yeah, I would say, it wasn't until my teenage years that I really um found, neurodivergent as a word that I could use to describe myself. And it felt like um, you know, a better word to describe myself. It felt like something that was a lot more inclusive of my experiences and didn't necessarily um you know pathologize me as much as other terms, because I guess just to clarify, neurodivergent is an umbrella term. It's not a diagnosis. So if someone gets diagnosed, they would be diagnosed as autistic or ADHD, etc. um but within the social model of disability, the neurodiversity movement um seeks to, again, like really value the lived experiences of neurodivergent people and acknowledge that being neurodivergent is a natural variation in the ways that our brains work. Um, Everyone's brain works differently, whether we're neurodivergent or neurotypical, and even neurotypical is a term that emerged because of, the whole spectrum of neurodiversity. I would say earlier on in my life, um, coming from India to the US, I always found transitions really difficult. And because I was really young when I first came here, um, it took years of processing that shock. And, in some ways, I don't want to use the word trauma, but um, because of how, rushed that felt. I was young and I had little control over the whole experience. Um, I was also like adjusting to being in a new country where social norms are different. So, in India, if people are, displaying affection by touching, That's not necessarily something that's viewed as abnormal necessarily, just because we're looking at it from, that cultural lens, and that's something that's a lot more ingrained culturally.
Mm.
But in a lot of other Western countries, it's not something that they appreciate. They appreciate a lot more personal space. And so I had to find my space, in that environment where relationships, friendships are just a lot more distant. But when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have this um perspective, I'm different from everyone necessarily. I just remember, having just being really intense about everything. I think our experience of the world as neurodivergent people from a lot of the other people that I've met is just that we experience the world in a way that is incredibly intense sometimes. And I'm not sure how common this is for everyone, but for myself and for some of the other people that I've met, we tend to um, have certain differences in when we acquire, different skills when we're young, because um, neurodiversity encompasses a lot of neurodevelopmental conditions. So for me, I started reading at a much younger age, in school when they were teaching us to form words and sentences in a really specific way that was really difficult for me to learn in that way, but I was already able to read sentences and to read paragraphs like without following a lot of those like standard conventions like hyperlexic kind of almost, where it's like it just came naturally in a different way, and I was able to process that on my own. And I found that a lot of other people have these experiences where early on, they're not necessarily labeled as, having a disability, but are labeled as gifted. So it's almost like those two uh, ends of the spectrum are almost incongruence with each other, because on one end, those same traits that are deficits are also what make us gifted, depending on, how it's viewed. But then again, everyone's experience is different. Um, and so early on in my life, I didn't necessarily know that neurodiversity is as common as it is, because it was never introduced to me as neurodiversity. It was introduced to me as learning disabilities or special needs, and a lot of these words were a lot more common back then, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. I feel like it's only really since the pandemic, the past 5 years, that we were seeing in the media um more positive and more accurate representations of neurodiversity. Not necessarily just positive, but experiences from people who are actually neurodivergent, who are actually living with these experiences. Because often what happens is someone comes up and they're saying, I'm a mental health expert. I'm there are people who are, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, and by virtue of that, sometimes they think, okay, well, this is what the DSM says about so and so disorder, but that's very different from what the lived experience
Absolutely.
of people who, have these cognitive differences are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the reasons that both of us agreed to do this, right? I think I'm not going to disclose much, but then we met because we disagreed on someone's post, right? Someone was talking about,
Yeah.
you know, both of us, Shreya and I, were wondering, why not this person psychoeducate people and talk about neurodivergence than to label and, call the condition disorder. And so I think that was something that we agreed on. And thank you for sharing, Shreya. I mean, is anything coming to mind, like something that has helped you? with your experiences? Do you think it's just awareness or knowing that, there are folks around who have had something similar, experienced something similar? How have you navigated life since when you've become, so aware?
Yeah, I think, I mean, within my family, there are a lot of, people who are probably neurodivergent who don't have that diagnostic label, but have had similar experiences. And whether it's in cousins of mine, or other relatives, it is something that you know um is genetic and is a lot more common than we realize, like within our own families. So I would say that's the first space where I was able to ask a lot of people. Obviously their experiences were very different. I think I've only really been able to find neurodivergent people that necessarily have the interests that I do and the tendencies that I have, and people who just tend to have shared interests, regardless of whether we're talking about neurodivergence or not. Because, I'm a writer, and I write poetry and fiction, so short stories, and I've been working on novels. And it wasn't until I went to a school for creative writing. I moved all the way from New Jersey to Michigan to study there, and I was able to take a lot of university level courses that no other school was offering, and I made this huge sacrifice for that. But when I was there, I finally met people who understood me, who felt the same way. Um, and we were all writers, and we realized, oh, well, perhaps we are given these different experiences of the world, these heightened senses for a reason. So while we may feel overwhelmed at other times, when we're writing and we're doing what we love, we feel most connected to ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah. And what are ways that have not helped you? Or, I'm just thinking about folks who don't understand neurodivergence. What has it been like to share who you are?
Yeah, I think it depends on, who I'm talking to as well, right? So, I feel like now that um I'm older, and I have a lot more autonomy with the decisions I make. It's different. Um, but um I think now is the time where I'm gonna bring it back to, my childhood, when neurodivergent wasn't necessarily a part of my vocabulary. It wasn't necessarily a word that anyone used. The people who were diagnosing me, they never used that word. Um, but I feel like now, I wouldn't necessarily like go out and use these terms unless people fully understand them, because in India and even in other countries, there are still people who um don't necessarily understand neurodiversity. And I think um as much as I feel like we shouldn't be limited by a label, what I've found in a lot of other people is a label has offered them clarity in a sense. They're reframing it to, you know, they're not lazy, or you know, inherently you know, unable to function in certain environments. It's because they're neurodivergent, and it's helped a lot of those people. But I feel like for me, what hasn't helped is um often the language that we use to talk about neurodiversity, when we're seeing it from the perspective of like deficits, rather than thinking of like what are the person's strengths and how can we use those strengths to help the person. um and it's the language I use will obviously differ with, whoever I'm talking to, because I have to make sure that they understand. But on my trips back to India, I don't think I've ever really used the word neurodivergent because, I have to more so explain it as like, you know, these are some of the things I need to do in order to function because um my mind works a little differently. So
Right. Okay. Fine. And I'm not sure if I can, put all the questions that we have together. Maybe we'll leave it open for the comments or for anyone asking. But I just wanted to know, how has it been different for you, right? Like early on, when you said when you would speak to professionals, maybe they would, label or use the terms, and then later on, when you become aware of, something as neurodivergence, what difference has it made? Like early on, if you met a professional, they would diagnose you or they would say that this is what it is. But now, does it feel liberating to know that it's not a diagnosis, it's not a disorder, but it's neurodivergence? And does it feel liberating?
yeah, it feels liberating because another thing that is really the reason why we should listen to the lived experiences of neurodivergent people, even if they're not mental health experts, is because um, whenever we're researching something about, our own experiences, we tend to really go into extensive research and
Mm.
really become experts on certain topics. So that's why when I was, explaining it to other people, they said, you know so much about it, and obviously, I'm living through it and this is just my experience, but I went on and was reading through the diagnostic criteria and all of that. um I think for me, earlier on, so at first, when I was younger, it was ADHD, but I didn't necessarily relate to other people who had ADHD because ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and I was never, hyperactive. I was more hypoactive. I would always be able to sit still. I never had issues with that, and it's more of like if I enjoy something, I don't necessarily um have trouble focusing, but otherwise I may. But I never really resonated with that diagnosis. And I was really young, so I was just like, I ignored it. This
Hmm.
doesn't really matter to me. But then later on, as I got older and I realized that, oh, it's okay to be neurodivergent, because I feel like before that it had been portrayed as something that I had to overcome, as something that um was a part of me, but was not necessarily something that other people would want to um celebrate. It was more something that I had to get over and I had to come out of more so. And then with autism, for a long time, I thought that, any of the autistic people that I knew, because my parents had friends whose children were autistic, and they were nonverbal, non-speaking, so they couldn't speak. And then, oh, I was able to speak, so but then I was still able to connect with them. And I wondered, even though we have such different experiences, why am I still able to connect with them? And then I realized that, oh, autism is so wide a spectrum that, even if I'm able to speak, to communicate, a lot of the other experiences I have from a sensory perspective, or just in um, issues I have in, social environments, can be a part of that. So yeah, it wasn't until, again, I was reading books by people who are actually neurodivergent, who are, exploring it in fiction, but even having representation of that is really important, because before that, all of the forms of representation that I'd been exposed to had been incredibly one-sided and didn't take into account all of the different ways of being neurodivergent.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's so good to have representation, right? Like I'm just thinking that representation helps not just in one person's experiences, but the others as well. And for those who don't understand it, who don't know where, folks with neurodivergence are coming from, I think that really helps. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
is there anything else, Shreya, that you want to share, that you want to pass on to the others who are listening and watching? Anything that you want to
Yeah,
be
I
aware
think
of?
Yeah, I think I would also kind of go back into kind of, the history of, how we're using these diagnostic labels because 100 years ago these labels didn't exist. But people were neurodivergent, people were different. They just didn't have these labels. And then um I don't know, 30, 40 or however many years ago, these labels became a lot more prevalent and especially in this century are used a lot more. Um, but then, people were neurodivergent before, they still are neurodivergent now. And I guess the message that I would have for people is just rather than trying to conform to rules set by others is to set your own rules. As a neurodivergent person, find out what works for you and what doesn't. And to not let it be um like uh I don't know, prison sentence or anything that like stops you
Yeah,
from doing anything else, that just because um you know just because you have this diagnosis, it doesn't change anything. You were neurodivergent before the diagnosis and you're still neurodivergent. Now you have a diagnosis to show other people so that you can potentially get support, but it doesn't change who you are. You still are capable of doing whatever you want to do. Because I feel like for a lot of people, um especially because people are, internalizing the narratives from others um when they're talking about diagnosis. And even if you're undiagnosed, I feel like there's a lot of talk about, is self-diagnosis valid? So, I mean, I feel like when it comes to um other disorders, maybe other mental illnesses like, anxiety or depression or, physical illnesses as well, self-diagnosis may not be the right way to go, because only professional diagnosis would may be helpful because you really need that support. But if you're neurodivergent, I feel like more recently, just like people are, self-identifying as queer or within the LGBTQ community, I feel like neurodiversity is also one of those things that it is a neurodevelopmental difference, and it is something that you can actually be diagnosed with um by a professional, but it's also something that you know yourself best. And until you're able to get that diagnosis, um it's okay to self-diagnose, I feel. I mean, not for all mental health conditions, but I'm saying specifically for neurodiversity, because for a lot of people, depending on what country they live in, getting a diagnosis may not always grant support. If it does, then it makes complete sense. Otherwise, they may be um labeled even more, and it may create barriers. So you have to make the decision that's best for your current circumstances.
absolutely. I agree with you. I think what I'm taking away from this conversation today is, like you said, right? Before you got to know, or before you had a diagnosis, you were neurodivergent, and now you still are, and now you have more language. You understand, you know, this is the way I am, or this is the way you are, and you'll learn to navigate life with neurodivergence. And with that, we've come towards the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Shreya, for sharing with us. It's been lovely. Let's see what we get in the comments, and if anyone is interested to know more, they can definitely send us a message and we'll get back to them.
course. Yeah. I'm really interested in reading the comments once this video is put out on any platforms. And if anyone wants to share their own personal experiences, perspectives, or questions, I'm really looking forward to reading about them.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe we'll come up with some more sequels. Right.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching.
Yeah. Thank you so